Hi, everyone. Today, I am happy to welcome our guest, Joseph T. Stuart. He is a professor of history at St. Mary's University in Bismarck, North Dakota. So, hi, Joseph. It's a great pleasure
Hello.
to welcome you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me today.
So before we start, I think going today, I'd like actually to discuss with you a number of topics, including your book on Christopher Dawson. However, before we get into that, tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. Yes. So I grew up in the state of Michigan and studied history and religion and philosophy before heading off to graduate school in Scotland. I had the great joy of studying at the University of St. Andrews and also the University of Edinburgh in Scotland for the master's and PhD. And then came back to the United States in 2009, 10, somewhere in there, and started working here at the University of Mary here in Bismarck, and met my wife here, and now we have 4 kids, so here I am, and able to be the head of history here, which is such an honor and a joy, and get to teach in classes in all kinds of different subjects. So it's been a wonderful journey so far in my career.
Yeah, that's great. It's exciting. Also, you are actually a member now of the International Society for the Comparative Studies of Civilizations. Why did you join? How did you join and
Yeah,
why?
thanks. Yeah, thanks for that. No, I'm really excited. This is just an unusual, unique society. I'm very excited to discover it through one of your other members, kind of word of mouth, um, because of its interdisciplinary nature in particular. So I'm noticing in the recent issue, anthropologists, philosopher who wrote an article. That's a pretty, and historians, obviously. So that's a pretty wide breadth of fields that's unusual to see in a peer-reviewed professional journal kind of situation. And I love interdisciplinary work. The man I've studied and written about for 20 years, Christopher Dawson, was a very interdisciplinary figure. And so I'm excited to not only for that, but also for the reason of the study of civilizations, which, you have a lot of specialists who focus on different aspects of civilizations, but you don't have a lot of organizations looking at sort of some of the bigger questions that bring cutting edge research, yes, focused, specialized, but also focused on big questions. And that I'm excited about.
What made you like turn to Christopher Dawson in the first place? Why is he interesting? Should he be interesting for us too?
Yeah. Let me show you quick his picture here. So this is him in 1930. As a young man, he was an Englishman. He was an English historian of culture, who is really famous for developing the idea that religion and culture are sort of like the driving forces of history, right? So one of his most famous books is this one called The Dynamics of World History. And it's just wonderful essays in this book about, in a very interdisciplinary way, about the importance of a society or a culture's religion or its vision, whatever that might be, in the way that it plays out in the different aspects of culture, from economics to society, et cetera. And then building on that, the interaction between different cultures, as sort of the engines behind historical change, the exchange of ideas and things. And so Dawson is interested in world history and civilization and culture in a really broad way. And I was interested in history and the relationship to religion and culture too. And so he became sort of a model for me to study and say, okay, so here's a way to do it, not the only or even the best way, but a way. And so how can I then implement this with my students and in my own research? And I have just found it to be tremendously fruitful. And so this book is partly coming out of that fruitfulness of Dawson's approach.
Dawson, I was reading your short review of it and also listened to your podcast with our member, Stephen Sadkiewicz. And you mentioned that an important aspect of Christopher Dawson was that he experienced the First World War, mm-hmm. and that his thoughts and philosophies come from that moment.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, no, the first one. So he was born in 1889. So he was around 25 when it started, and he was a little older, but he still could have been drafted, of course, but he was a little bit too sickly, so he wasn't part of the First World War in a physical military sense, but he certainly was in a emotional and spiritual and intellectual sense, like everybody was at that time in the early 20th century. And I guess one way that it really shaped him and others, including Arnold Toynbee, one of the founders of the International Society for the Comparative Studies of Civilizations, was the First World War gave the lie to the nationalist interpretation of history, right? Dawson literally wrote at one point, look, historians were partly to blame for the First World War because they had created the narratives that formed everybody's minds about how history works, which is a story of nations in conflict with each other. That story influenced the minds of the diplomats and the politicians and the military leaders in 1914 to create an unbelievable civilizational tragedy. Toynbee comes out of that thinking, okay, we need to focus on world history and civilizations. Dawson does too, but just in a little bit different direction, and we can get into this more in detail. But the different direction was, yes, civilizations, but to look at civilizations, we need to go a step below, and we need to engage with the anthropologists in the study of culture and see various cultures that combine, different cultural traditions that combine with each other to make civilizations. That would he would see a slightly more appropriate empirical approach. He thought Toynbee was a little bit too philosophical at some points. Dawson wanted to engage a little bit more with the anthropologists before touching the philosophers.
This now makes me think of actually one basic question. What is civilization according to you, or maybe Christopher Dawson?
Yeah, that's great. So Dawson wrote a book on it's called The Age of the Gods, and it's an ancient history. It's actually his first book, and published in 1928. Was widely reviewed internationally and widely respected by archaeologists and historians, and he's writing about sort of the beginnings of civilization in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and in Europe, and sort of the coalescence of these different factors, ranging from engineering to agricultural techniques to language and alphabet to a higher religion. And so Dawson really sees civilization as a comprehensive kind of reality that includes multiple different cultural traditions and a certain self-awareness, a certain ability in food production to have specialized kinds of positions, like the priesthood and the educated classes and the scribes who are able to preserve knowledge. So yeah, the civilization is different than culture. Every human society in the world has a culture. Not every human society has a civilization, right? One of the societies that I've studied is the Mandan Indians of my part of the world on the Missouri River in North Dakota, who have a beautiful, rich, incredible culture, but not quite. They didn't quite rise to the level of civilization, right? Almost. They had settled existence. They had even some specialization, but they didn't really have a written language with alphabets and monumental architecture. They didn't it's more of a proto-civilization, right? So that's by no means any kind of judgment on them. It's just a question of looking at sort of the different stratifications that different human societies reach. So I think that would be Dawson's kind of approach.
Talking now about the Mandans, you mentioned in your article review that they are examples of a river civilization.
Yeah, a river, sort of a proto-civilization. Yeah, because the Missouri River here in North Dakota provided similar environmental benefits as the Nile in Egypt, or the Tigris and the Euphrates, or the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, in the sense that the good soil that's along the river, the kinds of irrigation that were possible, and here, very important on the plains, is protection from the wind, right? So you have a river valley, and so you farm and live in the valley, and the winds blow over top of you, right? And we get a lot of wind here in North Dakota. And transportation, of course, defense against the Sioux further east. There were lots of reasons that this amazing longest river in North America, the Missouri River, played in the life of this people that are analogous to other river civilizations in the world.
What you also write in your review is how today, even though the Mandan are well, not exactly extinct. There are those that carry the blood of the Mandan. However, there are values that have been carried on, passed on to people who now live there. Like, as you mentioned, stability, generosity. How does that happen? How does that mean that values from one culture pass on to another?
Yeah. Yeah, wow, that's an amazing question. So I'm interested in the Mandan culture as sort of like a case study in Christopher Dawson's wider, understanding of culture, right? So it's just one of my little areas that I try to do to try to illustrate some of Dawson's wider points. And so there's, I think, two ways to look at this, right? So first of all is the specific observation that you brought out here about the Mandan and the values, yeah, of stability, of agriculture. And these are values very much of my state of North Dakota in the wider Euro-American population that's kind of come into contact with this Native American population, because it's a harsh environment here. And so in order to survive, you have to be a community. You must work together. You can't leave the person who's stranded on the road broken down along the freeway. You have to pick them up. You have to help them. When there's flooding on the Red River or the Missouri River, you have to come in together as a community to help people. So agriculture and stability. I'm at a Benedictine university. The Benedictines are known for their stability. There's just an interesting sort of just cross-cultural kind of resonance that's happened here in this part of the world with the Native American and the Euro-American cultures. Now, to your other point about how does this happen? Well, so the way Dawson looks at culture as something interdisciplinary is that every culture has a vision at the top of ideas and beliefs and assumptions, and that vision is sort of worked out in the ways of life of the people. There are folk ways, in particular, there are work ways, and there are place ways, right? So Dawson's vision of culture is fourfold. Okay, you have an I at the top for ideas, and then you have an F for folk, W for work, and P for place. All right, so IFWP is sort of a paradigm of culture for Dawson. Every culture has it. The Mandan have an IFWP, the Euro-Americans have an IFWP, the Aboriginal Australians have an IFWP. And so that's a local reality in history. But what's interesting about our humanity is that culture is not simply something that's local. It has an ability to transcend its local environment, even at a material level. So if you take horses or tools or guns and you take them out of the Spanish culture in Mexico and you move them up the Missouri River and you begin trading with the Mandans in these physical artifacts, that's transcultural. It changes their way of life. They adapt to the new reality of guns and horses about 1750. But this is even more true when it comes to ideas of a people that can spread through books, through just general contact, through missionaries, through whoever, schools. And you see it all the way back to the ancient Greeks and the texts of Plato that are still widely read, at least were read widely in not just the West, but also the Islamic East. You can see the power of ideas to transcend culture. And this is why Dawson would critique a figure like Oswald Spengler, one of the other great world historians that was a little bit older than him, previous generation. But Spengler had this idea that all the cultures are just kind of their own independent entities that kind of rise and fall like the flowers. They're beautiful and then they die out and then the next one comes along. And Dawson would say, yes, to a point, cultures do rise and fall. There is an organic, natural rhythm in human life, but there's more than the organic. There's also the transcultural. There's also this intellectual and spiritual element that can transcend culture, which means that a culture is not simply relative to itself, but rather they come in contact, engage with each other on higher questions of truth and meaning that mean that Spengler's vision was a little bit narrow and just ultimately the cultural relativism of Spengler was not only wrong, it was also dangerous. It fed directly into the kind of Nietzschean Superman mentality of 1920s in Germany.
Yeah, that's very interesting. What Christopher Dawson mentions, this four, like I see you like I read it in your review, the thought and belief, and that if one of these four is changed, then this is a whole new process then that starts happening.
That's right.
How could we then apply it? Because once I read this, I was thinking, okay, how can I mirror it to where I live? What's happening? and then what's happening on a global level.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Let me see if I can, I was going to see if I could share a screen here. Let's see. Yes, here it is. All right. So I created just a little diagram of what Dawson is talking about here with culture on the left side, and then so ideas, folk, work, and place, right? So these are his four elements of any culture, right? He's claiming this is sort of universal categories that we can use for comparative study between cultures or even civilizations. And so there's an aspect of community that's in each of these four. So thought and belief, people and their folk ways, workways, technology, and then the location or the natural environment. And so what's interesting about this, BB, is that this is an immediate recipe for interdisciplinary study, right? Because if you're going to understand a culture as a whole, immediately we say, okay, well, what are the disciplines that would deal with the ideas aspect of culture, right? So, theology, philosophy, intellectual history, psychology, language study, all those kinds of fields would be relevant to that study. What about folkways? Well, sociology, social history, anthropology, just, so you can go, economics and all the way down to geography and maybe even geology and climate studies and environmental studies. If you're going to understand a culture, you don't have to be an expert on all of those, but you need to have the humility to be interested in those other fields, talk to people who are experts, and then in your own writing and thinking and speaking, figure out ways to kind of weave together those different insights to give a sense for the culture as a whole. That's hard because we want to stick in our safe places in our disciplines. But Dawson's vision is very challenging here to go beyond and make friends with other people in societies like this one, where you can profit from each other's expertise. So then the third column are historical examples of each of these, how these kind of can work in culture. So a university, for example, folkways of marriage rights and feudalism and work, guilds of workers. Place, one of the most fascinating examples I've recently learned about are the Ethiopian church forests, which are about 1,000 years old. And they are churches dotted across northern Ethiopia that are surrounded by trees that have not been cut down because they're considered sacred with the church. It's just beautiful. You can find beautiful YouTube videos on these, just amazing. So that's definitely a relationship between the vision of that culture and its geographical environmental location, right? So we could draw, if I was teaching the students on my whiteboard in classroom, I would draw an arrow from I down to the P to show the influence between those two things, right? And what you are asking about is change, right? This dynamic element of culture. What happens is one of these elements, something will happen in history that'll change it, and then that shapes the rest of the culture, right? So the Mandan example I used of the horses and the guns would shape the F and the W elements of the culture. And so then that shapes the way they relate to place through hunting buffalo. It even, interestingly, shaped their view, their worldview, in the sacredness of the horse, in their gratitude to God for the horses, etc. So that's an example of material change affecting the whole culture. You can also, even more powerful kind of change is from the spiritual, intellectual level. So you can change the ideas of a culture or even of a civilization, and then that, like say Muhammad rises up in Arabia, right? And his new vision unites all the different warring and violent tribes of the Arabian Peninsula into this new culture that then forms a new civilization that happens through the eye, shaping the ways of the folk ways of life, the work ways of life, and even the interaction with place and architecture and things of Islamic civilization as a whole. So not only does this model of culture describe culture at any one point in history, like a synchronic view, it also helps us understand change through time, or a diachronic view of culture.
Very interesting. This brings to my mind a thought by, I don't know if you heard of him, Hendrik van Loon.
No.
He was also a journalist, but historian.
Okay.
That it's more than the facts. It's more important to feel history.
Yeah.
And somehow this, what you were now talking about, somehow brings to mind that really sometimes it's even more important to feel history than know the facts.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
these
that's
of course are
great.
important to know, but feeling then really
Mhm.
helps us understand culture
Mhm.
and ultimately civilization.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one of my favorite quotations about history uh, comes from the book The Historian's Craft by Mark Bloch, who was walking with one of his friends at a conference one time, and they were just talking, and the quotation was this was a quotation from Henri Perrin, a friend of Bloch, and Perrin said, I'm a historian." No, he said, "If I were an antiquarian, I would only love old things, but I'm a historian, therefore I love life." And I think he was trying to gesture at exactly what you said about a feeling and emotion, and allowing one's ability to empathize with people in the past to be nourished by one's empathy and participation in life in the present. Because that life in the present is what alerts you to the different human conditions and factors, which, yes, different in the past, but nonetheless, if you don't have that sort of emotional connection to, it's difficult to enter into it in a really meaningful way in the past, I think.
True, true. And also, here comes now, I think also key word is interdisciplinary.
Yeah.
Because um, how much I gather, you can't understand Dawson
Mm-hmm.
if you don't understand what interdisciplinary thinking is. And
Yeah.
that is one of the prerequisites to understand. That means him, but also the not exactly the empathy or understanding, emotional and feeling. However, somehow I do feel that they are correlated a bit. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Um, let me first say, yes, the interdisciplinary is essential to Dawson, and again, this related to his post World War I environment, because what happens, what happened in the Great War, and as in a lot of major events, is that you have to survive it, you have to get through it. So you sort of focus all your efforts on one thing, right? If you were French, that one thing was killing Germans, right? If you were German, it was killing, you had to focus that your whole society was geared toward that one thing as a kind of vast simplification. And Dawson saw this as a feature of modern thought often, this reductionism, this kind of simplification, whether in Marx, a simplification to simply the W factor in culture or economics, right? Or in various nationalist historians who simplified everything to place, to the nation as the explanation of the whole. No, Dawson would say, no, you've got IFWP. You can't just simplify it to one of those elements. Even the I, Hegel did that. That's not human life. That's not history. You can't. It's not just about ideas either. And then practically, when people begin simplifying like this, Dawson called it the lust for simplification. That affects politics, because you have the Treaty of Versailles, for example, which blamed everything on Germany. That was a simplification. That was disastrous. It set us up for World War II. So this problem of simplification is not only academic, it is very practical. And the way around it is to teach people what is civilization, what are the cultures that make up a civilization, and how to really understand that object of knowledge is to do it through different disciplines. And you do that through friendships and alliances between different people who have different backgrounds and expertise, so that you can precisely learn from each other and understand that whole better. And that's a good model, seems to me, for any kind of organization, let alone politics.
Do you think that could be maybe one of our main suggestions for today's world?
I do. Yeah, I do. I think that, and that's one reason I love studying Dawson, because he's a constant challenge and reminder of this importance. But he was off. Dawson was off. He was widely reviewed and respected, but he was often rejected by other academic historians, precisely because he was interdisciplinary. They wanted him. History is history, right? And so Dawson didn't have a normal academic career. He taught at the University of Essex in Southwest England for a while in the 1920s, and then he ended his career at Harvard for a number of years. But in between, he was largely excluded from the British academic kind of world, and I think that's why is kind of that lack of sympathy for that interdisciplinary approach. But if you look at it and you look at the past, you say, okay, well, a lot of those academic historians, their books are no longer read; they're forgotten. Dawson's books are almost all of them still in print, which is a remarkable fact for a historian that's been dead more than 50 years.
Do you think interdisciplinary thinking is on the rise today, or it is still struggling, as in the case of Christopher Dawson?
Yeah, I think we reached a low point in interdisciplinary thinking in the mid and late 20th century, when people were, deeply invested in a kind of scientific specialization. I think the postmodern age has helped us a little bit by loosening the grip that the empiricist kind of mentality has had on us, and is allowing us to once again to bring in the importance of imagination, creativity, even mythology in shaping the narratives that then shape society. And people are realizing, I think, more deeply that unless we understand those narratives and these bigger pictures that people are interested in, we're going to really struggle to make sense of our world. And so I'm hopeful. I think there's a lot of work to do yet. There needs to be a lot of more members of the society for the study of comparative civilizations. And there needs to be new societies in different fields and different places. But yes, I have seen signs since the 1990s of increased interest in interdisciplinary work. And I think that's one reason that Dawson's books have been reprinted starting in 2001 till today. They're being reprinted, republished with nice introductions and just really nice scholarly editions of them. And I think that's one reason they've been reprinted and are selling, internationally, in Brazil, Spain, USA, other parts of Europe. Dawson is being pretty widely read today.
Well, that's great. That means that there is still hope, I guess, for our world and understanding. Because I was recently reading how interdisciplinary thinking is important, actually, for creativity. You reminded me now when you mentioned imagination, because if there is no imagination, if you can't think in more directions,
yeah,
and imagination, creativity do move society forward. And
that's right.
And our cultures and our civilization and civilizations around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. That's well put. And Dawson is a beautiful writer. He grew up on the border between England and Wales, and in a 12th century castle where he was born, which is now a used bookstore. And his mother was of Welsh ancestry, and she was deeply interested in Welsh mythology and literature and the saints and things. And he talks about in his memoir about just the important role that imagination played in his upbringing and in his thinking about history. I mean, one reason I appreciate Dawson is because he did have an almost postmodern sense about him in the literary imagination, in the construction of history being really important. But he also went to Oxford and was trained in sort of the methods of historical study and research, and he kind of brought those two worlds together. He made history both an art and a science, and I think that's really one of the keys here to his longevity.
Oh, that's a great way. Art and science, together. Yeah. Never thought of that. That's a great takeaway. Well, I think we've had now in this talk a number of takeaways for our audience. So where is your book available?
Sure. So it's available on Amazon.com and at the Catholic University of America Press. And the title is Christopher Dawson. And it's basically an attempt to look at not so much his biography, but his intellectual trajectory, I call his cultural mind, and that was shaped by not just the study of history, but also anthropology, sociology, and comparative religion. So it's showing the first part of the book is looking at how those disciplines shaped his cultural mind. And then the second part of the book is how he applied that cultural mind in the fields of politics and education. So I would call it more a biographical study, I suppose, than a biography. But it's, looking at sort of the wider cultural history of the early 20th century as well.
Are you planning a further book or on Christopher Dawson or some part of his work? Or I'm not sure. Writing something completely different?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. Maybe. I'm working on a few projects on Dawson, little ones right now. There was an essay I discovered that was unpublished that he wrote in manuscript form. So I've transcribed that with some student help. and that's getting published here in a few weeks in the Chesterton Review. So that'll be really fun. But you know, Bibi, what I've often thought is that we don't necessarily need more studies of Dawson. We need people doing what Dawson did. And so I've been experimenting with, in my other book, with, okay, what would a Dawsonian cultural kind of approach that takes religion seriously and the material factors of life seriously, what would that look like if we looked at the 18th century and the Age of Enlightenment? And we did that in a way which was taking advantage of recent scholarship, but also this big kind of civilizational view, right? And so I did that in this book in the Rethinking the Enlightenment, Faith in the Age of Reason, as an attempt to try to show what it could look like to do Dawson in a different field, in an area that he didn't necessarily, write about directly. And so that actually particularly excites me. And going forward into the future is doing a kind of cultural and civilizational scholarship inspired by Dawson, but doing it in a new way oriented toward the future of scholarship.
Sort of applying the process, because actually, in a way, I that's what you did in the Mandan review.
That's right.
So it can be applied, well, from the ancient civilizations today.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, look forward. That's a highly interesting project, actually.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, Joseph, it was wonderful talking to you. I've really enjoyed and have a number of takeaway lessons from our chat. And I hope our viewers too. You can get Joseph's book on Amazon. And well, I look forward then to meeting you perhaps at our conference in the future, and wishing you all the best.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me on today. Thank you, Bibi.
Bye-bye.